Yeah, just because. Totally. Let's do it. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Brown. I'm a doctoral candidate over in geography, and very pleased today to introduce Dr. Patrick Bigger, who is a research director at the Climate and Community Project. And before that was a lecturer at Lancaster University in the UK in economic geography. A senior research associate there, has published widely in many geography journals, too many to name, but all the big names, the Annals, Antipode, EPA, and D, and is no stranger to California. Did his PhD at University of Kentucky on California's cap and trade emissions trading scheme and all its zany loopholes. So we're going to hear today Patrick presenting on fiscal justice for Caribbean climate action. And I, for one, am really thrilled to see this insight into sort of new frontier of financial extraction and colonialism in a place that was a birthplace of global colonialism and the slave trade, but also a birthplace of Black radical traditions, anti-colonial movements, and many socialist experiments on a scale that has inspired the world. So with that, let's hear from Patrick. Welcome.
Thanks again, Keith. That was great, and thanks so much for coming to join us. You know, I had forgotten how California time worked, and I was getting pretty nervous at noon that I was going to be talking to an empty room. So I appreciate y'all showing up. Like he said, my name is Patrick Bigger. I'm the research director at the Climate and Community Project. We are basically a climate justice think tank with a kind of unconventional structure. There's 3 of us staff, and then we have 40 academic members from universities around the country who we can kind of draft in to work on individual projects. And so this project is a collaboration that I'm doing with Fayla Jacobs at the University of Minnesota. She's in the policy school there. And then 2 graduate research assistants, Kata Zajkar at Harvard and Avery Sinclair Rains at Hopkins. This work builds on previous work that I've done on kind of macroeconomic issues and how they intersect with various aspects of our ecological crisis. For a long time, I've had a project with Jess Dempsey at the University of British Columbia on for-profit biodiversity, and specifically on how debt and tax injustices limit biodiversity conservation investment and how that structures like the Convention on Biological Diversity. This paper builds on a paper that I wrote with Olufemi Taiwo last year on debt justice for climate reparations. That was kind of a global look at some of the issues that we're going to be looking at today. And this is really a kind of mid-project check-in on our attempt to ground some of that thinking on macroeconomic justice, environmental reparations, and grounding that in the Caribbean. So since this is a work in progress, your feedback is very, very much appreciated at this stage. The main thing that I want to show in this talk is how fiscal extraction in the form of predatory debt service and tax avoidance, which is in turn structured by legacies of colonialism and the ongoing organization and northern dominance of political economic organization, produces vulnerability to the impacts of ecological crisis and limits ambition on climate action. So there's a lot going on in that statement. So to work through these issues, I'm going to go through a loose framework based on recent thinking around polycrisis, or the condition of manifold overlapping crises in which solutions to individual components are quite likely to exacerbate others. I'll do this by talking about how macroeconomic problems, most notably the looming global South fiscal crisis, amplify the risks and damage of the ecological crisis. After an overview of some of these global issues, we'll zoom in on the Caribbean, a region where these aspects of the polycrisis are dangerously co-constituting. In that section, I will mostly be talking about a model that we built that compares fiscal outflows for debt service and tax avoidance to projection of costs for climate action and the volume of climate finance mobilized in the Caribbean through international financial institutions like the World Bank. We then consider a range of initiatives that have been offered in response to this fiscal ecological crisis nexus, And not to spoil the punchline, but we find that most existing proposals are insufficient at best and counterproductive at worst. On a bilateral basis, we focus on PAC 2030, the U.S. Caribbean Partnership to address the climate crisis, which was announced last year. And then we conclude by outlining a more reparative approach to these crises, with the caveat that these are largely our ideas coming from our research team. And the next phase of the project is to take our work on lost fiscal capacity to civil society partners in 4 Caribbean countries to better understand how a reparative approach to redressing these fiscal injustice issues could, what kinds of worlds they make imaginable with additional state capacity and less fiscal extraction. All right, so let's dive in. At COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley up there burst onto the international stage with a comprehensive call for step changes in the way that climate action is financed, governed, and perhaps even conceptualized. Prime Minister Mottley thundered that climate finance to frontline small island developing states declined by 25% in 2019. Failure to provide the critical climate finance and that loss of damage is measured in lives and livelihoods in our communities. Mottley's strength in turning wonky fiscal policy issues into compelling oratory has contributed to more sustained recognition and growing social movement demands that something must be done about the economic and institutional drivers of climate and ecological vulnerability. This imperative, however, is not new. Questions about resource mobilization, the quote unquote common but differentiated responsibilities all nations have regarding climate action, and sustainable development in the global south have been on the table at least since the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. But what has changed are the economic and environmental conditions that shape these analyses, conditions that have become increasingly dangerous over the last 30 years and are interacting in new and insidious ways. Historically, negotiations about who should bear the cost of ecological crisis and how responses to it should be funded have turned on how things like bilateral official development aid, international financial institution funding, and private investment, and how those are channeled to the global south. One of the first primary solutions to this question was the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, which was an ill-conceived, ineffective global carbon offsetting market that caused more climate and biodiversity harm than good. There's Al Gore arguing for the clean development mechanism. More recent initiatives have centered on the creation of funds and quantitative financial targets, like the $100 billion per year climate finance commitment that rich world governments made at Copenhagen in 2009. That target of $100 billion per year was not achieved and has never been met. Even more troubling is that about 80% of the climate finance included in that tally is distributed as loans, which is creating dangerous trade-offs at the debt ecological crisis nexus. So you can see here, these are the volumes of total climate finance mobilized. You should see fall well short of the $100 billion goal. And then analysis from Oxfam on the proportion of how that funding is distributed. And then the effective kind of dollar value of that. You see that it falls down around 20% of the goal when accounting for things like debt service costs. Activists and Global South negotiators have long argued that climate finance flowing from north to south should not be seen as charity, but as partial compensation for some of the ecological and social debts the North has incurred over the course of industrialization, imperialism, and the everyday operation of the global political economy that structurally disadvantages the South. Northern governments, of course, have long rejected a compensatory framing because that would admit liability and open the door for even more legal action against governments and major polluters. This is one of the long-term sticking points around agreeing a loss and damage facility at the climate negotiations. But these rejections don't resolve the fact that the global north and increasingly China and some other big emitters have been engaging in a kind of atmospheric and ecological imperialism, claiming a hugely disproportionate share of total greenhouse gases that the atmosphere can safely absorb, and appropriating vast swaths of the global biosphere through consumption of products that depend on extractivism and habitat destruction. This is a sort of series of figures from work done by Jason Hickel and colleagues that sort of shows the On the top, the material drain through unequal exchange and the appropriation of materials flowing from north to south, and then the how to visualize that in monetary terms. They really just show truly astonishing levels of expropriation. And this is the data that underlies the observation that those who've contributed the least to climate change are already suffering from its impacts most acutely. The inescapable conclusion is that mostly post-industrial countries have benefited and continue to benefit from extremely high emissions development models that are now, in the words of the economist Haju Chang, kicking the ladder out from under global South countries with no clear path out of the polycrisis. And so in this talk, we're going to focus on one corner of this thing that is called the polycrisis. People have criticized it for being sort of diffuse and all-encompassing and a theory of everything, but I still find it somewhat productive to think with in terms of isolating how separate parts of this polycrisis intersect with one another. In this case, the sort of fiscal and ecological dimensions. Folks like Adam Tooze and Tim Sahay and Kate McKenzie have been largely responsible for the term's recent popularization, even though it was also picked up widely at the World Economic Forum in Davos last year, which is a very surprising turn. But Tooze defines it not just as a situation where you face multiple crises, which sidebar I would say is, probably most of human history, but instead it's a situation where the whole is even more dangerous than the sum of its parts, which we've gotten there through, deepening interconnections over the era of neoliberal globalization, the kind of complex supply chains that bind us all together, and then of course the sort of global nature of the ecological crisis. And contending with the polycrisis demands an approach that rejects unserious half measures and hyper-targeted technocratic fixes that we see from supposedly various serious people and institutions like John Kerry or the IMF. Sorry. All right, so a couple of slides ago, we saw one salient dimension of the polycrisis on the more purely climate financial side as the global north continues to miss their financial targets. But now we're going to drill into the kind of real meat of what is driving our concern here in terms of fiscal extraction. And here we are mostly concerned with sovereign external debt service and tax avoidance and how they contribute to ecological vulnerability while imposing a ceiling on sustainable development and climate adaptation ambitions. And I use terms like sustainable development and resilience advisedly, fully aware of their limitations. And I hope you'll be sort of generous in going with me on the kind of most fulsome version of that possible. I'm not trying to, recreate the things that were agreed at the Earth Summit or anything. I think we're thinking more liberatory, more ambitious, more autonomous than those words often suggest. And so in terms of the debt stuff, I think mostly we can be forgiven if we haven't been keeping up with the extent to which vast swaths of the global South are facing fiscal duress and debt default, and the familiar pattern of moralizing, foot dragging, and austerity that usually marks international responses to these kinds of crises. After a brief splash of attention about debt in the midst of COVID lockdowns, and then maybe again a blip during the Pakistani flooding last summer, the issue has largely disappeared from the North American press unless you go looking for it. And so here we can see debt levels rising in emerging and developing economies that are on a GDP per capita level above where they were kind of at the outset of the global South debt crisis, or the so-called third world debt crisis in the early 1980s. And a map from the French campaign to abolish the illegitimate debt that shows you all of the countries that are facing some level of debt distress, which you can see cuts a swath across the global South. Drags on public finances, along with COVID, public spending needs, and lost economic activity, were followed by a rapid escalation in both interest rates and dollar strengthening that's made servicing debt dramatically more expensive, which has deepened this existing debt crisis that started bubbling up in 2019. Climate change and biodiversity loss are implicated in these dynamics, for instance, as a driver of inflation by affecting food and fuel prices, or through turbocharging disasters that necessitate big borrowing for recovery spending. Dramatically illustrated once again by the floods in Pakistan last summer that caused between 30 and 40 billion in damages and economic losses in a country that was already facing rising debt services and a liquidity crunch to pay for rising fuel import bills and COVID-related borrowing. This year in 2023, the cost of servicing Pakistani debt is projected to exceed total government revenue. So the total tax take wouldn't be enough just to cover debt service, much less all the other things that you want government to do. As of June of last year, 58% of countries in the global south were either in or on the brink of debt distress. And the UN Development Program finds that 28 of the 50 most climate vulnerable countries are at a high risk of debt distress, including several in the Caribbean and many of the Pacific small island developing states. Between 2019 and 2021, debt in Barbados rose from 119 to 141% of GDP, in the Bahamas from 60 to 90, St. Lucia from 60 to 96, and in Dominica, which is still recovering from massive damages from the hurricane in 2017, from 90 to 107. These are numbers that are bearable in the global north, but tend to be used as flags by like the IMF that a country is at or over the sort of precipice of debt distress. And while these numbers have fallen somewhat in the last year as some fiscal pressure eased, debt still represents a major drag on public finance around the world and especially in the Caribbean. And so these shocks of COVID, of escalating climate disasters, of action taken by the US Federal Reserve that makes borrowing costs more expensive, really accelerated the trend of rising global South debt over the last 15 years. This rise, if you are reading something like the Financial Times or one of the major US newspapers, is typically attributed to predatory Chinese project finance, right? Like the Chinese are out there doing all this lending in the world. And that's true. There has been a lot more Chinese lending over the last 20 years. But that bilateral funding is at most a plurality in most countries. Instead, lower income countries primarily owe to official, especially multilateral creditors, while in middle income countries, like most of those in the Caribbean, have mostly incurred debt from private lenders through accelerated market rate borrowing on the international bond market, a process that was often encouraged by IFI policy. So that we can see those two situations illustrated here. This is for middle income countries, and you can see the increasing, I'm sorry, this is in SIDS. We can see that private bondholders represent 50% of the debt held in 2020, while this is for basically IDA eligible low income countries. You can see that the vast majority of the debt is held by official and especially multilateral creditors. The Global South debt crisis began percolating with news of distress in Sri Lanka and Zambia in 2019, and then exploded as COVID economic shocks began to reverberate through the global system, prompting multilateral lender action to shore up liquidity through debt suspension and an emergency release of IMF's special drawing rights, which are a sort of IMF currency that can be used to access dollars and things like that for liquidity. It's basically a basket of currencies. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that. These actions tapped the brakes on growing fiscal pressures, but did not alleviate them in any sustainable way. For example, the G20's flagship debt relief program, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, was only available to 73 countries, of whom 40 took part. China is the largest bilateral lender, suspended or canceled the most debt of any creditor. Meanwhile, the World Bank, whose stated mission is poverty alleviation, did not participate at all and continued to mandate debt service through the acute phase of the COVID emergency, which is the process that sent millions of people around the world back into absolute poverty. Furthermore, the G20 and the Paris Club was unsuccessful in convincing private creditors to take part, which is a problem when you've got an escalating volume of debt held by private creditors. which meant that these private creditors continued to siphon badly needed resources from south to north unabated. In 2021, English banks alone collected $3 billion in debt service from these DSSI eligible countries. So real neo-colonialism hours. And so just to sort of summarize, maybe take a step back a little bit and understand how the debt and climate crises, and I would expand that to the kind of ecological crisis more broadly, kind of co-constitutes. This is a very handy graphic made by colleagues at Eurodat. I think Daniel Munivar made this. So you basically start out with countries, there's increasing impacts of the climate emergency coming. Countries need to fulfill their sustainable development objectives and adapt to climate change. They have to go out and borrow to do that. Furthermore, when disaster strikes, they have to go out and borrow more to do disaster recovery. That money is often not available in the form of grants or even concessional lending. So it's like market rate lending, which means that public finance comes in the form of loans. Climate vulnerable countries have higher borrowing costs than their non-vulnerable neighbors. Analysis by the V20, the vulnerable 20 group of countries, found that climate vulnerable countries pay 1.2% higher interest than their non-vulnerable counterparts. So there's already a sort of a financial penalty associated with being vulnerable, even while your adaptation costs are higher, which leads to a buildup in public debt, which then leads to even further higher borrowing costs because you're seen as, a risky borrower. It's not clear if your debt service is long-term sustainable. Then maybe another climate event, another emergency hits. Debt payments have to continue to be made even in the midst of attempting to recover from a significant climate event, which leads to reduced fiscal space, basically less money available for social or climate investment, which means that in order to service your debt, you are reliant on fossil and natural resource extraction in order to pay debt service. This is the case in a place like Zambia or Chad that are in severe debt distress, but have to service their debt in dollars. And so that forces, in Zambia's case, it's largely copper, and Chad, it's oil, which then contributes to further ecological and climate breakdown, and the circle goes on and on. And so basically what we're trying to do here with colleagues at places like the Debt Justice UK, at Recourse, at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, trying to figure out policies that create wedges that sort of break this cycle and lead to, a different kind of trajectory, a more reparative trajectory. And so that's really the motivation for this work. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay, seeing none. Feel free to stop me anytime also. I don't want to just talk at you unbroken for 50 minutes. It sounds boring. For you, not for me. And then finally, before zooming in on the Caribbean, I want to briefly discuss the other dimension of fiscal extraction we're concerned with, and that frankly is less well developed than the debt side, which is partially because of just where we've applied our research time so far. It's also because people just write a lot less about about tax, because it's opaque and complicated, and honestly, it's boring as hell. But it's also incredibly important to understand how tax avoidance happens, especially in countries in the global south, given that that is another kind of drag on public resources, right? So there's debt service and paying that, but there's also just the foregone revenue from tax avoidance that makes it harder to take, any kind of social or ecological investment. And so you can think about how much less attention tax gets than debt. If any of y'all remember when the Panama Papers came out in 2016, and there were headlines in The Guardian and stuff for 48 hours, and then what happened after that? Just nothing. And it's important because low levels of financial transparency and clear definitions of tax havens means that it's really hard to quantify the cost of tax abuses to governments around the world. Some have tried. One IMF estimate is that the multinational tax avoidance and evasion regime costs governments around 500 to 600 billion annually in lost corporate tax revenue, which even with my sort of limited quantitative skills can tell you is 5 or 6 times higher than the ambition of raising 100 billion for climate finance. And of that corporate lost corporate tax revenue, low-income countries lose 200 billion, which is both a higher proportion than the global north relative to their GDP, right? Like it's a bigger chunk of a bigger piece of a smaller pie. And it's also larger than the 150 billion of annual foreign aid that they receive in total. So more being lost to corporate tax abuses than goes out in ODA. While the IMF and other development lenders have historically focused on building capacity for tax collection amongst its citizens in the global south as part of structural adjustment austerity measures, there's been rather less global north political will to address cross-border financial flows that would disproportionately impact northern companies. And so building this political will is a critical part of achieving a sort of fiscal justice approach to climate change. All right, so bearing that in mind, I want to zoom into the Caribbean, and for any Caribbeanists in the audience, I apologize in advance for doing severe violence through this extremely high level overview and very short version of Caribbean history and understanding how it fits both in the world system and in terms of understanding innovations in fiscal extraction. But I do find this quote by Sir Hilary Beckles very clarifying, where he says that the modern Caribbean economy was invented, structured, and managed by European states for one purpose: to achieve maximum wealth extraction to fuel and sustain their national financial, commercial, and industrial transformation, unquote. From indigenous enslavement to work in the mines, to kidnap and enslavement of Africans, to work on plantations and huge colonial landholdings, to the invention of the joint stock company to accelerate the transfer of wealth from New World to the Old, the Caribbean has been a key site in the formation of the world system predicated on racial capitalism and ever more baroque processes of fiscal extraction that sends profits abroad while leaving risks behind. This is not, of course, to say that there was not resistance over the long durée of Caribbean exploitation. The Haitian Revolution and subsequent slave revolts in places like Barbados helped put an end to formal slavery alongside other tectonic shifts in the global economy that were sort of already at the turn of the 19th century, starting to push the Caribbean towards the periphery in a way. This period represented a shift in the mode of production towards wage labor and the import of indentured labor, but did not necessarily reverse the economic decline nor offer much in the way of meaningful opportunity for free communities to remake Caribbean economies. And the waning influence of the European colonial powers gave way to the rise of US influence during the 20th century, most notably in this scene in this famous political cartoon from 1904 that probably most folks have seen Roosevelt tromping around the Caribbean and the sort of Roosevelt corollary. But it's just really striking that the most visible aspect of that is as debt collector, right? There's all sorts of other sort of motivations, but this sort of will to enforce disciplinary debt relationships is a long established one. So skipping ahead to during the independence period from the 50s to the 70s, that influence was supplemented by the exercise of Euro-American power through the operations of like the World Bank and IMF, and then later the Inter-American Development Bank. But at the same time, Caribbean scholars and politicians like Eric Williams and Walter Rodney led on articulating fundamental changes to the relations between and within nations, such as more democratic control of the means of production and investment, along with deeper integration of the Southern economies, culminating in some ways with the UN General Assembly passage of the Declaration for the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, or NEO, and the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States in 1974. There's the passage of the NEO. But as Northern powers were able to drag their feet over the course of the 70s, and the impacts of the 1973 oil shock and subsequent recession began to reverberate through the global economy, the promise of the NEO faded and the birth of neoliberalism began to punish the global South. Really ultimately leading to the conditions that I think a lot of folks are familiar with in terms of the third world debt crisis, which was particularly vexing in the Caribbean, as many of the countries were categorized officially as middle income, making it more difficult to access concessional borrowing or other mechanisms to stabilize liquidity and solvency issues, or participate in debt restructuring programs, which is an ongoing problem that has complicated both COVID recovery and access to more robust climate finance. So these are sort of all conditions that have persisted across different regimes of accumulation. And that's a big problem. It's always been a big problem. It's a big problem now as these sort of aspects of the polycrisis coalesce, because simmering fiscal crises are poised to boil over across a region that was already experiencing high levels of aggregate debt and escalating debt service costs even before COVID. And then COVID, of course, had really detrimental impacts on Caribbean economies, especially those that were reliant on tourism. On a debt to deep, which is important to access funding to service, dollar denominated debt and things like that. And on top of that, tropical storms caused an average of nearly 1 billion in losses annually in Caribbean SIDS, with region-wide damages set to exceed 6% of GDP per year by 2100, according to some projections. 70% of the region's population lives in coastal areas that are subject to both violent storms and the slow violence of sea level rise. And these physical vulnerabilities are magnified by social and economic factors like narrow range of exports with relatively little opportunity for diversification, dependence on agricultural and industrial imports, high transportation and communication costs, and rampant inequality, often formatted through like the process of structural adjustment that contributes to many people living in risky housing. And so that backdrop really sets the stage for a closer look at how fiscal extraction limits climate investment and ambition. I really sincerely apologize for this in the next slide. This is, like I said, work in progress. We're working with colleagues at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung to put together some slick graphics for this and work on SIDS more broadly. But for now, I'm just going to confront you with this sort of like wall of numbers and try to make sense of it. And obviously, this is not a super elegant like input-output model like colleagues at UNCTAD and the IMF are trying to put together for similar issues. But we nonetheless find these figures to be plausible, roughly in line with projections in the literature, and most helpfully probably updated for post-COVID conditions. We draw our 2021 debt service figures from CARICOM's statistical service, 2021 tax avoidance figures from the Tax Justice Network, GDP and government spending from the IMF, and average annual losses from meteorological disasters from the World Bank's 360 Resilience Report covering 2000 to 2020. Come back to that. And so this is something of a convenient sample. As you can see, we're using all, primarily Anglophone CARICOM members that are sovereigns. So this does not include some incredibly important cases and places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, but it sort of gives us a basis to start working through these issues with comparable data sets. But again, there's some flattening going on here that we are very much aware of, and we're going to try to work through some of the differences through our case studies in Belize, Dominica, St. Kitts, and the Bahamas to get a sort of range of both geographic and sort of socioeconomic cases to work through. All right, so the headline figure here is this. Anyway, right here, the headline figure, the fiscal drain through debt service and tax avoidance is $3.15 billion in 2021. Region-wide, which region-wide is also 4.19% of GDP. You can see that those numbers range from as high as 13% in St. Lucia down to 1% in Guyana. But nonetheless, across the region, this figure is also about triple the average annual losses from tropical storms. So, just fiscal extraction has the same impact as all the hurricanes that would hit in the Caribbean annually. The fiscal drain is even more troubling if we situate these losses in average government spending in the region in 2021, which was about 33% of GDP, or 10% below the US and 20% below the Nordics. So again, a relatively smaller piece of a relatively smaller pie. And And on average, fiscal outflows from debt service and tax avoidance knock a quarter off of government spending on the whole. Our next step was projecting the cost of climate action, which is notoriously challenging. There's a number of different methods that folks have used to try to do this, and I'm happy to talk through. We basically are taking countries' word for how much it will cost by drawing projected costs from their nationally determined contributions that countries file through the Paris process. And using that number is risky because methodologies and data quality vary widely, and around half of countries haven't even attempted to quantify costs. But with those limitations in mind, effectively what we did was take the countries that did have it, did have those costs either for mitigation or adaptation, average those on a percentage of GDP basis, and then apply those to countries that had not submitted them to create a region-wide average. We did this for both mitigation and adaptation. We have more confidence in mitigation, where 9 of 13 countries submitted mitigation costs. Only 7 of 13 submitted for adaptation. So that's somewhat lower confidence, but nonetheless, we find that combined cost at 4.3% of GDP per year in each country, with 3% in mitigation and 1.3% in adaptation, which seems low, but is nonetheless sort of broadly in line with projections that you get from the literature. And there's endless issues that we could explore in this data, but the top line is that fiscal extraction through debt service and tax avoidance is 122% of the projected cost of achieving plans described in these countries' indices. And freeing up this fiscal space through debt and tax justice would enable countries effectively to double their ambition overnight. And there's complications with that in terms of how spending plans are structured as being conditional on further international investment. But just as a sort of broad understanding that we can sort of use to take this to like global North climate organizers, to climate activists in the global South and in the Caribbean, it's a sort of neat figure to talk through and think about. If you had access to double the finance, well, what else could you do? How else could you imagine the future to be different? And that is really building on Adam Getachu's notion, as deployed by my colleague Femi Taiwo, of world-making reparations, right? About imagining worlds that could be different. About the way that Femi likes to put it is reparations is like building the foundation and providing the tools such that people then can build the house as they see fit, right? But you can't do that without getting to a place where you're in the position to put that foundation in place first. So that's really what we're after, but that is not largely what has been on offer through the range of existing proposals to deal with different aspects of this poly-crisis conjuncture that we're looking through. I'm just going to run through these real quick because they're just kind of boring and sad. There's the OECD proposal to harmonize certain tax rules, which culminated in the global 15% corporate minimum tax, which is not nothing, but there's been few incentives to carry out tax reform in a way that is redistributive or reparative, or that serves global South countries that serve to lose out on the existence of tax havens, but won't necessarily benefit from a global minimum tax or potentially have the tools to implement it. So tax, there's been something, it's not a whole hell of a lot. On the debt side, I already talked about the kind of catastrophic failure of the debt service suspension initiative. That was the G20 program that the World Bank didn't participate in. The second phase of that was supposed to be called it is called the Common Framework, which is basically a common set of steps that a country in debt distress goes through with its creditors to achieve resolution. Chad, which was the first country to go through the process, illustrates the key problems with the Common Framework. Took about 1.5 years to reach a agreement that was agreed in November, which offers no long-term debt relief and actually increases Chad's reliance on oil exports to service their debt, which is primarily held by Glencore, the Swiss oil and mineral trading firm, which is hardly the economic diversification needed to curb climate change or on the fiscal side, decreased dependency on volatile commodity markets, which is often one of the ways that debt distress manifests. Skip the RST. That's Christina Georgieva and Paul Kagame of Rwanda agreeing on a loan of special drawing rights through this Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Basically, it's a new loan program from the IMF that also comes with strings attached that look a lot like previous forms of IMF conditionality. And then finally, just to briefly look at how multilateral environmental finance is often designed, there's a wide variety of funds and facilities like the Global Environmental Facility or the Green Climate Fund, as well as a lot of bilateral environmental finance flows that all cleave to this logic of blended finance, which is the main idea behind the idea of blended finance and really entire IFI strategies is that public resources will never be sufficient to achieve critical social and environmental aims. So private return-seeking capital must always fill the gaps. And what that means is that IFIs and bilateral funds shouldn't use their resources for direct funding, but instead to de-risk investments for private capital through mechanisms and capacity building exercises that help Southern countries access private sector investment. And while it's hard to prove a causal relationship, the increasing turn towards blended finance over the last 15 years has broadly mirrored increased debt levels across the South. So we can see how private sector investment here is like radically eclipsed official development aid over the last, 33 years, and how aid has effectively been flat while private sector investment has been going up. Like, not all foreign direct investment is bad, of course. A lot of countries would really welcome that. It's the way that it's structured, and it's the way that scarce public money is used to effectively subsidize those investments that's really troubling. And this might sound familiar to any like US climate activists here, because this is more or less the same logic as most of the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of this using the state to de-risk private investment. And so those are some of the multilateral responses, but one of the main motivations in this report is really to push back on US bilateral policy with the Caribbean, and specifically this US Caribbean Partnership to Address the Climate Crisis 2030, announced here by Vice President Harris in June last year, that begins by stating the Biden-Harris administration recognizes the unique and evolving climate and energy challenges facing Caribbean nations, and we are committed to working together on solutions. This comprehensive, adaptive, and goal-oriented approach will support our Caribbean neighbors in addressing energy security and climate adaptation, and so on. All right, so far so good, but what does it actually do? And in short, what I would say is that the exact same strategy could have been articulated in 2008 or 2012 or 2018. In the words of Daniela Gabor, it is pure Wall Street consensus that forms the backbone of this blended finance approach that is just chock-a-block in PAC 2030. It lays out 4 pillars of action. First, improving access to development financing, which has a couple of little good things like making mandatory debt service pauses in the event of climate disasters. But the bulk of this is about increasing Caribbean countries' access to global bond markets to be able to borrow more at market rates. The second pillar is facilitating project development and investment, which is basically a way to subsidize US investment in a region. There's 6 different mechanisms that all point to the conception, design, and deployment of public-private partnerships between Caribbean states and US infrastructure firms, particularly for building Caribbean technical capacity for attracting private investment in renewable power systems, which is, of course, a good and important end. But again, the mechanism by which it happens and the way that profits are able to be repatriated to the US is pretty problematic. The third pillar turns on building local capacity for broader climate aims beyond energy, once again, chock full of these kind of de-risking logics, including public-private partnerships for climate data and private investment in Caribbean STEM education. There's also a bunch on natural climate solutions, which is usually a code word for carbon offsetting, which of course is not great. In this case, it's more about marine protected areas, which have also been very problematic in dispossessing people of access to ocean resources, while concentrating access in those most capital intensive or able to deploy capital intensive modes of blue economy extraction. And there's the last one that's just about a series of meetings that the US will facilitate. So overall, we think that PAC 2030 is an outdated, unambitious slate of actions that appears more interested in expanding markets for US industry and finance than meaningfully addressing the production and realization of vulnerability to climate and or economic shocks across the Caribbean. So just that's sort of the state of the problem. Again, a lot of our sort of more solutions oriented work, which is one of the great parts about having left academia and joined advocacy, is I can think a lot more about solutions. But I think we can sort of start charting a path. And one of the places to start is an extraordinarily surprising place, which is the US House of Representatives. That there was a bill that was introduced last year. It's been reintroduced in this session. I'm not going to read the whole title because it is literally 130 words long. But House Res 1373 concludes with the recognition that it's the duty of the federal government to issue reparations containing multiple elements, including apology, award, and guarantee of non-repetition of harms for the harms of colonialism and subsequent forms of imperialism, which have undermined sovereignty, democracy, self-determination, social and economic rights, and human and ecological well-being in both the colonial and post-colonial era. And critically for our purposes today, it's disproportionate responsibility for the climate breakdown, the burden of which unjustly and overwhelmingly falls on the global South. We co-signed that. And by adopting this resolution and others that are shortly forthcoming in that chamber, dealing more specifically with climate reparations, that would offer legislative guidance on the kinds of actions that the executive should be delivering and instructions for US voting shares at various IFIs where the US wields outside influence. On the debt side of the equation, there's a number of stopgap interventions that have been proposed that would taken together would start to overhaul the global debt system, which is what's really needed. Again, like foreign direct investment, like debt is not in and of itself bad, right? Like debt lets you smooth big costs across time, lets multiple generations bear the cost. It's when it's sort of structured in very extractive predatory ways that it becomes odious, unsustainable, and needs to sort of have a reset, which is where we're at now. So really what we're thinking about is a large scale slate of debt cancellation that goes beyond the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, which was kind of the ultimate resolution to the third world debt crisis, but really failed by only applying to low income countries and failing to bring on board private creditors, which as we've seen is a major component of the current debt crisis. This can be achieved in some part by new legislation in New York State and London, where the vast majority of global debt contracts fall under the jurisdiction of. Folks are working on that already in New York State and London. So there's the potential to be able to stop, vulture funds like you may be familiar with in like Argentina, or is what's happening with BlackRock in Zambia. BlackRock stands to make 110% profit on forcing Zambia to repay those debts, in the aftermath of COVID and in the face of this devastating environmental change. On the other side of the ledger, on the kind of climate finance side, and there's just got to be a U.S. commitment to paying a fair share. Friends of the Earth reckons that's 6 to 8 billion per year based on historical emissions, but that leaves out other ways that the U.S. has contributed to climate vulnerability. That 6 to 8 trillion, or 6 to 8 billion rather, 6 to 8 trillion is probably better, but 6 to 8 billion would be triple what was included in Biden's most recent budget request last week. So that is absolutely unacceptable. And on top of this, the US and other major polluters must ensure that the new loss and damage facility agreed at COP27 is amply capitalized and accessible to all Southern countries. And maybe less well-known, COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity also just approved a new fund in December that has to be similarly well capitalized. On the tax side, there's exciting stuff going on. A motion passed the UNGA in November that was tabled by the African Union with support of Norway to create a global tax compact, basically moving global tax governance away from the undemocratic OECD to the more broadly democratic UN process. It could do things like set up a World Trade Organization-like body for tax and international tax dispute court. And it could also coordinate with other branches of the UN, like the Green Climate Fund, to be able to articulate a way of channeling money from a global tax system into Southern climate action. And so in closing, the movement for a UN-centered tax compact rearticulates one of the globally democratic demands of the new international economic order adopted by the UNGA 50 years ago, but with an additional focus on climate. Given the manifold ongoing failures of the world's most powerful institutions to take serious action on fiscal and ecological crises in progressive ways, proposals at places like the G77 under Cuba's presidency are being hashed out to relocate important climate finance and government governance competencies from anti-democratic IFIs to one country, one vote UN bodies. In the Caribbean, debt justice and a new global tax compact would create fiscal space to increase investment in adaptation, disaster preparation, low carbon development, and social investments that improve people's everyday lives. I said the next phase of the project is to take this data to partner CSOs in the Caribbean to really help build more evocative visions of what we could push for in terms of reparative approaches. A stronger grasp of these the ramifications of extractive political economic relations might also help Northern climate activists better situate their work in international solidarity, even as they work to for decarbonization that benefits their own communities too. So I will leave it there and say thanks very much. Look forward to talking with you about it.
All right, thank you, Patrick. We're going to do questions. We're going to see you as questions and do 3 at a time and then let Patrick respond to a batch. So have at it. Who wants to ask a question? And please, we're going to pass around these microphones to make sure we get it on the recording for those listening in from home. Anybody got a question? Okay, go for it. Get us started.
I'm curious, I think it's back maybe a few slides where you're comparing tax and
Sure.
debt for Caribbean countries. I was wondering, it looks like tax, I think it's the one before, maybe.
Yep.
Yeah. So on this one, it looks like tax avoidance is smaller generally. So I'm wondering if that's, you had previously said that tax avoidance is sort of a bigger piece of the smaller pie. And so I'm wondering if this is just for Caribbean countries, but is that different from other or sort of just low income countries? How does this compare to other countries, I guess? Because it seems like here tax avoidance is actually smaller than debt service.
Yeah, no, it is. Sorry, I should have been clear about what I was referring to. So that was in comparison to how tax avoidance impacts Northern economies, right? So like tax avoidance is a bigger piece of a smaller pie across the South than it is in the North, right? What varies is not so much regionally often, but based on how dependent on extractive industries countries are. Countries that are more reliant on extractives tend to be subjected to more tax abuses. Of course, this is also incredibly complicated in the Caribbean, given, well, we've learned not to say tax havens with a lot of folks in the Caribbean. It didn't go over well. And so just in terms of, secrecy jurisdictions or complicated tax relationships, the Caribbean is kind of a unique case. But nonetheless, we feel okay about these numbers because this is primarily about multinational corporation tax avoidance rather than, high net wealth individuals or other kinds of gaming that goes on through secrecy jurisdictions. So.
Go for it.
Yeah, sort of sticking on this side, you talked about all debt not necessarily being bad, right, as a way to smooth costs, but that the problem is predatory debt structures. What sort of percentage of this debt service that you're listing here would you say is sort of falls into that predatory versus the good debt?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of it will depend on individual country circumstances. I mean, I think that there's an aspect of predatoriness given the sort of baked in extra debt service cost associated with being a climate vulnerable country. So we're already talking about a large chunk of debt service costs being additional on what one might otherwise expect. I think that there's also a component of, a lot of borrowing that has to take place in order to undertake mitigation and adaptation that would be otherwise unnecessary. You could conceptualize as a form of odious debt, given the low responsibility of these countries for causing this problem in the first place. But more broadly, I think that a lot of organizations, and we'd have to work through this, but let's say that most, if not all, of this debt is predatory in a way, given the structure of political economic relations that systematically are unfavorable to Southern countries. And so, if you want to start with a clean slate, we really need to be working towards widespread cancellation and jubilee, with the understanding that future debt is governed under more fair, a fairer framework. So there's a number of different ways you can take that. I guess I'm going to be rather non-committal about this, having not actually sort of gone through each country's loan book. But say on a conceptual level, we would find most of this debt to be candidate for cancellation.
I was wondering if your analysis included like tax relief or incentives that Caribbean countries sometimes have. So I'm from Jamaica and I know that we have like a bill that says if a foreign entity invests in a hotel or local, they won't pay any taxes for 10 years. And so like, is that included?
No, that's not included. I think that's more granular than we've got the capacity to get into. This is really directly borrowing the numbers from Tax Justice Network. And like, if we got into all of those kind of race to the bottom tax incentives, I think these numbers would look a lot worse. That's one of the reasons that like these are not numbers that you can, take to the IMF for like policy making, but I think these are sort of advocacy numbers just to like understand the scope. And so on that basis, I think they work. But yeah, and there's a lot of nooks and crannies we can peer into and find a lot more extraction going on, I think. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I have two questions for you.
Mhm.
The first one, I'm curious about like where the debt starts, or when the debt starts for some of the countries listed, because there's like a 20-year gap, right? In some of the countries like gaining sovereignty. So I'm just curious about like, what is the date at which debt is starting? Is it carrying over from when they were colonized, or is it like something that starts post-colonial? So that's my first question. The second question, I mean, I'm really curious, like, why didn't you include Haiti on the list? And because we're talking about debt, and obviously like that's an entire thing with a much longer history, right? Being the first country that was sovereign. So I'm curious as to why Haiti was excluded on the list. And maybe like what it might tell you about debt structure in the Caribbean.
Yeah, totally. Those are both super good questions. In terms of like when the debt starts, I don't have a great answer to that. In some ways, like I don't know how much debt they were carrying, over from the colonial period and the transition period. That's a good question. I'm going to look into that. In terms of why we went with the sample that we did, the honest answer, a lot of it has to do with data availability. And I initially did include Haiti in this table, and there's a previous version that most of these would have been, that I just like filled in the cell red on the spreadsheet that I was working in, because there's nothing available. And so I think our solution to that is in the final report. We're going to, have a sort of pull-out section on Haiti and talk through it in a narrative way, because it is so important in sort of as a site of resistance, as a site of extraction, as a site of sort of how northern predations play out in the Caribbean. But also understanding that like, because a lot of it's like there's effectively like no tax avoidance because there's so little foreign investment there. And so like it actually like sort of makes the numbers overall, like it doesn't give you it doesn't contribute to the sort of like overall narrative in a particularly helpful way. So I think talking through it in a narrative fashion is more satisfying than just trying to like lump it in with these other countries, because it is such a different case in a lot of ways. And in terms of like why we didn't include other countries, it really goes back to data comparability and CARICOM being the sort of like regional statistics aggregator, making us feel pretty confident that we can use these data comparatively in a way that like self-reporting doesn't necessarily allow for.
Well, I just have one question. Well, one question in addition to the other ones that I just asked. So that I can contextualize sort of the stakes of debt. What happens when a country doesn't pay back debt? Because I think I'm not sure. In my head, I'm like, do they get penalized with more fines and fees, or is it like a sort of military occupation situation? What are the stakes of a country not paying back the debt?
I mean, historically, yeah, it was military occupation and, seizing assets until the, what usually, colonial power felt as though they had been amply compensated. That's probably not on the table in many situations now. I think instead you reach the sort of, international pariah status where, you can't access, any kind of lending or financial facility from the World Bank, IMF, your regional development bank, whatever. You can't access funding through whatever bilateral channel. You certainly can't access like the international debt market, right? There's that like old, like, Marxist canard about like the only thing worse than being exploited by capital is not being exploited by capital. And that's sort of the same thing for debt, right? The only thing like worse than having unmanageable debt is not having access to debt at all. Because like then you have a very hard time. If you are in the position where you're going to default, then presumably you have a lot of very pressing financial needs. And so being cut off from markets is really problematic, and you can be punished. I mean, we have seen what's happened over the course of the last 25 or 30 years in Argentina being the kind of classic case of default, and how they've just been torn to shreds by international markets, by vulture funds based in New York, using court system in the US for 25 years to pursue debt that they bought for pennies on the dollar and trying to claim it at par. And so there's a complicated sort of set of solutions people have talked about around like coordinated default, right? Like if every country defaults simultaneously, or all southern countries, and you can agree to that solidarity, then like you've sort of solved that collective action problem. Whereas if, one country goes into kind of unmanaged default, then it's much easier for them to be picked off one at a time. And so there has been mounting conversation. Maybe it's tempered off a little bit, but like really in 2020, when things got really bad with COVID, I think there was more discussion about, basically solidarity defaults and taking collective action on that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much for sharing this work. I just have a couple of questions. And one is, you mentioned a couple of times how, because many of these countries are designated as middle income, they have trouble accessing climate finance, they have trouble accessing debt assistance. And so, and sort of the different propositions you're putting forward, I wonder if you think it's about collapsing those types of distinctions. Does that justice look different for low-income countries versus climate vulnerable countries versus, like understanding this is all a big Venn diagram of different designations for different types of sort of advocacy. So that's one question. And then my other question is about the CSOs that are involved in the next step. And I, in thinking about the poly crisis, it's like, who isn't a stakeholder that's interested and involved in one of these crises? And so I'm really curious about which CSOs you are identifying as key partners in this important work.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, please.
I was curious about, the selection of the countries as sort of case studies.
Curious about the selection of countries as case studies. I know you mentioned sort of geographical variance among other things, but I'd love to hear that tied to the sort of CSO question. And I know you just also mentioned sort of beyond advocacy for, or like usefulness for like Northern climate activists. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you foresee this as useful for those governments or for CSOs, because I think someone who mentioned that this is clearly missing a lot, like this is, the data you all have access to, but there's so many things that on the more granular level that countries are dealing with. So I'd love to hear about what that looks like for you all.
Yeah, for sure. And so,
We get a CSO definition as well too.
sorry,
Jargon
civil
check.
society organizations, yes. So in terms of how we pick that set, part of it was, yeah, to get the sort of geographical and socioeconomic sort of variety. Another thing is that unbeknownst to us, our colleagues at Debt Justice UK were running a similar project with different countries. And so between our research and theirs, we'll have, I think, 9 countries that we're engaging with civil society. In addition to like big region-wide organizations like Canary and the CARICOM Reparations Committee that draws from a representative from each CARICOM member state, which has really been at the forefront, at least in terms of, you know, supranational institutions thinking about climate reparations in particular. So how we sort of engage with them is the process that we're in right now. Fortunately, my colleague Fayla Jacobs is both from St. Kitts and currently in St. Kitts. And so it'll be building out through her network. She's a, you know, Black feminist, disaster recovery scholar is her primary thing. And so she's worked with a lot of organizations in the past, and she will be sort of leading that engagement. And in terms of how we sort of think it's useful, that really depends on how those conversations go. It was, you know, conceived in dialogue with some folks in the Caribbean. I mean, it's been, I wouldn't say it's been entirely dialogic, but we've tried to build in that dialogue from the get-go. And really the aim is to make these kind of macro fiscal issues, you know, a part of arguments about climate justice, and how that plays in the Caribbean and the kinds of materials that you need in order to make that play. Obviously, very differently in the US, that we've got a more clear-cut path where, you know, we'll be doing a series of webinars and so working groups, especially with the DSA International Committee, who's like made debt justice one of their central organizing planks. But, you know, US climate organizing does tend to still be very parochial. And so thinking about, you know, domestic climate organizing within a framework of you know, global solidarity, I think is powerful and empowering, and hopefully helps people forge at least a better understanding of, you know, what the US's role in kind of ecological and fiscal breakdown looks like. I'm sorry, Meg, I didn't type. What was the other
Oh, the
question?
other question was about the like middle, low income.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about that. It's a good question. One of the only sort of interesting things about TAC 2030, like the US policy, is basically making all countries eligible, you know, on the same par as like IDA eligibility in the event of climate disaster. IDA, the International Development Association, which is like the kind of lender or finance provider for the poorest low-income countries. And so that would open up like new concessional finance regardless of a country's like this official designation. In terms of collapsing them, I don't know. I guess I could kind of see both sides on that, but there is also just such a giant kind of disconnect between who the creditors are, basically between countries that have had access to global bond markets and those who haven't, which largely sort of corresponds to one's, you know, official LIC-MIC designation, that even if you collapse them categorically, that doesn't necessarily change the fact that you need very different approaches depending on who the ultimate holder of the debt is. So yeah, you probably could, but what that does in practice, I don't know.
Sunny, you want to join? Yeah.
I feel like we've touched on this a little bit in talking about the sort of default, collective default roles for global North organizers and international solidarity, but I'm just wondering if there are any sort of particular levers you see for countries in the Caribbean or in the global South to sort of shift the power relations with their debt holders.
I have a question about de-risking. It seems like, I guess one way de-risking the term is used is like concessional investors picking up the tab when like a bet goes bad,
Yep.
but also it can also be used to like refer to actions that indebted countries have to take to like make investment more palatable, like either through like assuming risk or like imposing domestic costs on those on their own constituencies. And I'm wondering like whether you have ambitions to like quantify those costs, because I think that's like another important domestic cost to like consider. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that'd be interesting. We don't have any particular plans to try to quantify who is bearing the cost of de-risking. I mean, I do think that there's like interesting distributional questions there, especially as they play out, depending on who is kind of holding the bag for that risk. Whether it be USAID or, the Southern country government itself. And especially when those are structured through things like first loss guarantees, or like exchange rate risks. But no, I don't think that's sort of within the remit here. It's good though, you should do that. Sorry, what was the other one? Sunny, right. In terms of like global coordination mechanisms, I think that those are the discussions that are happening right now in a way under the auspices of like the 50th anniversary of the NEO kind of meetings that have been going on, kind of kicked off at a thing in New York a couple months ago. And then there is a much larger discussion at the beginning of Cuba's G77 presidency in Havana last month, to explore what that would look like. And, a lot of this sort of falls under the aegis of like the, either the new NEO or the like new non-aligned movement, or, something like this, where you do start to have better coordination and better solidarity between, large chunks of the majority world. But in terms of specific mechanisms, I don't know if there's anything that I feel particularly confident talking about.
I just wanted to ask about, I saw that, like you had that slide about private debt increasing. I wanted to ask, like, how much worse is that than it being indebted to a multilateral or a bilateral, like, loan? Like, are the terms worse if default happens?
Yeah. It's very challenging to deal with this. I mean, this is the kind of debt that most, forms like the vast majority of middle income countries' debt right now. And it's much harder because they're, even if you get all of your official creditors together, like through the Paris Club or through some other, DSSI or whatever, there's just no way to make private creditors play ball right now without sort of changes in regulatory capacity or regulatory enforcement mechanisms and, New York and London. So it's challenging, and that the cost of that debt will vary widely, and it can be structured through, an incredible, cornucopia of different mechanisms and structures, and, incur different kinds of fees. And so, there are probably better and worse versions of privately held debt out there, but especially if you are looking at, climate vulnerable places where this is an interesting thing, right? Because like in the domestic discussion is always about how capital doesn't price in climate risk, right? And that big fossil fuel firms can still get financing for doing incredibly destructive projects. And yet we see on the international level, like capital is perfectly capable of pricing in climate risks, but it is when they're charging those risks or assigning those risks to southern governments. So I'd say that is also a major challenge. And, there's a lot of different options. One of the, very challenging things is like, even if you could like write off a lot of the like official debt, that acts as like an implicit subsidy to the private creditors, right? I mean, like this is like what DSSI did in writing down those debts to the poorest countries. That accrued to like bond and oil traders and like Forex speculators, which is not what you want. So it's problematic on a number of levels, and really there's no solution to that without a sort of regulatory fix.
Time for one more, I think. I got one if we don't. On this very subject, you showed this spike in private investment in the global south around 2005 through 2008, even before the financial crash. What's going on there? What helped create that huge spike?
Spike in investment or in debt?
In foreign or excuse me, in specifically private rather than official development assistance. Yeah.
2005 to 8. I mean,
There's like this climb you showed, and then it just keeps going up after that, but that's like,
I mean, part of that
yeah,
is
there
that
we go. The blue and orange one. Yeah, exactly.
right. Part of that corresponds with the massive drop in debt that you get at the end of the HIPC, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, and other initiatives that radically reduced debt. And actually did, this is one of the kind of success stories really of like the kind of making people live healthier, better lives, was that by reducing debt, countries were able to invest more in, social spending. Maybe that helped open up those spaces. If there's like less debt overhang, there's more capital available to facilitate those kinds of investments. I know a lot more about the debt side of the story though, and so I couldn't really tell you why that specific boom occurs. I'm trying to think about when the exact boundaries of the commodity super cycle was. I don't know if that's all extractive capital, like extractive industries capital flowing in. I don't know. Maybe somebody else in the room has a good answer to that, but I don't.
All right.
Sorry to end on that unsatisfying note.
We need to leave mysteries for next time. Let's give a warm round of applause for Patrick and for Eva from Social Science Matrix who set us up. Great. See you all next time.